Trump realized, going back even to like kindergarten, Stan, that he could go do the most wild and outrageous and incredible things. And people didn't say no, didn't say stop, Donald. They stood and they stared. And I think that has been his motivating thing for the last nearly 80 years. And it tends to work because most people are not confrontational. Most people don't want the fight.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest on the podcast is Reed Galen. Reed Galen is truly a political expert. He's worked in senior roles on the campaigns of George Bush, John McCain, Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's a co-founder of the Lincoln Project, a group of Republicans fighting for pro-democracy issues. He's got a podcast called The Home Front. He's got a Substack, which is interesting. In our wide-ranging conversation today, we talk about Republican approaches to negotiation, Democratic approaches to negotiation, Donald Trump's approach to trying to persuade people, and what the Democrats can do to counter some of those aggressive tactics. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Reed Galen.
Thanks for having me.
So excited for this conversation. You and I have had quite a few conversations over the years about politics, and you're kind of my go-to guy on campaigns. I guess we've just had a big one. Donald Trump just defeated Kamala Harris. You know, campaigns are essentially negotiations. We're trying to persuade voters, and the Harris team did not succeed, and the Trump team did. So give us your analysis of what each of them did well or poorly.
Well, you know, I think it's interesting in negotiations, right? You're hoping that there will be an outcome that is, you know, maybe not perfect for both sides, but satisfactory to both sides. Politics is a little bit different. It is for the most part, a binary choice. Your candidate wins or they lose. The difference with voters, though, is that they do have a third choice. And I think that was really the definitive factor in 2024 was 5 million voters stayed home. 2 million voters in urban areas didn't participate. And, you know, if those voters turn out, even 10% of them, there's a really good chance Kamala Harris is preparing to be inaugurated in a couple of weeks, not Donald Trump taking office again. And so what I would say is this is you had, yes, there were underlying conditions in the country and in the world. There is an anti-incumbent, anti-status quo thing going on, not only in the United States, but also in Europe and other places that we've seen. But ultimately, and I'm guilty of this too, is that we in the what I would call pro-democracy space, and in this case, you know, aligned with the Democratic Party, thought it was enough to be against Donald Trump and to call out the things that were bad about him. I think oftentimes we forget that, you know, what I call the discount rate in politics, Stan, like Donald Trump's been a public bully for the better part of like 6 decades. Right. So like nothing surprises anybody about him. So if he says something that to an otherwise normal person seems outlandish, right, it's not unusual anymore, if that makes sense. Now, if Kamala Harris had come out and said, I'm going to use the powers of the state to lock up my opponents and I'm going to shut down the free press and all that, people would go crazy, right, because that would be so out of character for her. But for Trump, he gets away with a lot of it. And so I think there's that also, you know, in the context of a conversation, you know, the Republican Party, and this is not new, but they're at the top of their game on it, is they understand that the conversation is not merely political. And it is not just knocking on someone's door or calling them 8 weeks before an election. They have a 24/7, 365 communications infrastructure that is continually talking to their people, you know, and again, let's say 90% of it is not overtly political, right? It's not, but you draw people in. You know, there's been this talk, the left needs its own Joe Rogan. The truth is, Rogan talks very little about politics directly. You know, he had Trump on for 3 hours, okay, but what Rogan represents is the anti-status quo, the anti-establishment, that, you know, there are other ideas out there. There are things that we should question. Now, is a lot of it hooey? It is. But it's also entertaining, and we shouldn't deny that fact that the left has historically been worse at communicating on a cultural level and a personal level with voters because, frankly, Stan, they're just not very much fun. They're not entertaining because they're very like serious and self-serious and moralistic. And that's fine, but it doesn't make for someone wanting to listen to a 3-hour podcast, right? It's I call it the Howard Stern effect. If you remember back in the 80s, millions of people in New York were listening to him, half because they loved him. Why? Because they want to see what he said next. The other half hated him. Why? Because they wanted to see what he said next, right? This is not, most of this stuff isn't new. It's not novel. It's just something that we have not seen as pervasive as we have. And also, I'll just say the last piece on this is that whatever starts on the right from an information or / news perspective made its way to the mainstream because otherwise normal straight publications couldn't not cover it, if that makes sense, at least in their journalistic belief system. So I think that it was a combination of an overwhelming communications advantage, which Trump has always been brilliant at, whether you like him or not, and an unwillingness or inability on behalf of the Democratic Party to understand where the country is, which is it's not about high-mindedness. It's not about arcane issues. It's really about like they were defending the status quo. That was very tough to defend. And if you have a candidate who goes on a national television show who wants to take her boss's job and she says she can't figure out anything she'd do differently, when that's what the whole country is looking for, I think it's really tough to make the case.
So let's dive into some of that, particularly around Democrats could be more in touch with the culture and be more fun. Was that a candidate problem or a campaign problem? Could the Democrats have put Kamala Harris forward in a way that made her seem more culturally relevant and fun, or was that just a candidate problem?
No, I think they did. I think that actually I would say this, is that happened organically, right as President Biden said he was not going to run again, and Harris became the de facto nominee. You saw the stuff with the brat summer and all of this other stuff. There was an enormous amount of organic excitement, much of it probably just relief, Stan, from the idea that Biden was not going to stand for election again. But what seemed to happen to me was that they went through the convention, which was excellent. They did a great job on it. They positioned it very well to try and get, to try and hold on to core Democratic constituencies while reaching across the aisle and saying, to people like I used to be, right, a Republican I used to be. But what seemed to happen was maybe after the debate, the Harris campaign seemed to go from a place of wanting to win to trying not to lose, if that makes sense. I mean, if you're a football fan, think about the prevent defense, right? I hate the only thing the prevent defense does is prevent you from winning, right? Because you're giving up these big chunks of yardage. And that's what they started doing, which was they got very conservative. They got very cautious. They went to a whole data-driven strategy as opposed to a candidate-driven strategy. They were allowing algorithms and machines to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. And I think ultimately, and this is a problem the Democrats have had for a long time, is that in the absence of someone like a Barack Obama or a Bill Clinton, who is the message and the messenger, either they can't agree on what they believe in, or they're afraid to tell people what they believe in because they're afraid people won't like it. So it all comes down to, well, let's do something that takes our beliefs out of the mix, which is we'll just say, well, what are people telling us? What are these data points telling us? And like Stan, like politics isn't selling toothpaste, right? It's not like, well, Crest is better because 9 dentists say it's better than Colgate or whatever. In politics, if you're talking about toothpaste, it's, why you should use Crest? Because it's better and Colgate makes your teeth fall out, right? It's just a different way of marketing things. And Democrats tend to be very hesitant to, frankly, play hardball. They see it as climbing down in the mud. They see it as fighting dirty. Look, I've got asked this question. How come you guys are willing to fight dirty and we aren't? Like, everything that you need to beat Donald Trump, he says out loud. It's every day. Whether or not you're willing to use it in such a way that is effective is really up to you. So I think it's a philosophical problem. It's a belief problem. And then it's a strategic and a tactical issue, which is Democrats just aren't very good at politics. And that's not new either.
Before we dive into Democrats not being good at politics, I want to just sort of hit a little bit more on what happened to Kamala Harris. So Your view was she was doing okay coming out of the debate and the convention, but somewhat similar to my memory of Hillary Clinton. who also played not to lose and also didn't come out strong on policy towards her traditional constituents. Do you feel like if Harris, I guess it was my feeling because Trump won all 7 swing states, that Harris wasn't actually very close in the end. But it's your feeling that she could have won if they turned out the vote better, if she came out a little bit more aggressively against Trump. Was there hope there and that was just a campaign problem?
I mean, I think yes, because they lost. So it was by definition, from my perspective, a campaign problem. But again, think about, whether or not we're still called the Never Trump group or whatever, right? The disaffected Republicans. We had a theory of the case, Stan, that if at first Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris, if they could get to go back to football, if they could get to the 2-yard line, right, our people could probably get them into the end zone, right? That there were probably enough disaffected Republicans and disaffected independents who just wanted nothing more to do with the noise and the ugliness that we could probably help get them into the end zone. The issue is if you only get to the 7, right, like there's not enough of us to get you that last bit of the way to the goal line. And so that to me is a real issue, which was, they saw massive losses with Latinos, in particular Latino men, a doubling of the black men going to Trump. And then again, a whole bunch of voters just sitting it out. And again, remember, this was, these voters knew everything they needed to know about Donald Trump. They didn't maybe know as much as they needed to know about Harris, but the point was, like, when push came to shove, they couldn't be bothered to get off the couch. And I think that's a real issue, which is, I think that the Trump campaign, like, let me back up. Republicans historically fight campaigns in the context of values. Do you share a value with me? And the value then propagates to a particular issue, whatever it is, right? Individual liberty. Could be, more freedom in churches or whatever, small government, is about lower taxes. A strong national security, talks about, fighting, back in the day, fighting communism or whatever it is. Like, all those are now really out the window from the Republicans' perspective. But the point is that there was a value attached to something first before it became a policy. The Democrats are out of step with the value systems of their voters, because whether or not it's Latinos, whether or not it's African Americans, or whether or not it's Indian Americans, whether they're South Asian or East Asian, are far more culturally conservative than Democratic elites on the coasts. And so they were really fighting a two-front war, which is they were fighting this sort of anti-establishment, anti-status quo thing, while meantime being otherwise controlled by a very small group of people who demanded an orthodoxy in thinking that allowed the Republicans to say, see, we told you they don't agree with you. We told you they're not the same as you. We told you they believe different things than you. And Republicans have always been better at that. And I think that that's one thing that those of us who believe that Trump and this iteration of the Republican Party are fundamentally bad for the country, we all have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, how are we going to talk to these people? Because clearly what they're hearing from us, like democracy, that wasn't it, Stan, and that really upsets me. It wasn't enough. It was enough in 20. I know
that's been your calling card has been that Trump's anti-democratic.
And I think he is today, but it didn't work.
Yeah. Let's learn a little bit from your experience. You worked for Bush 43, you worked for Arnold Schwarzenegger, you worked for John McCain in very senior roles on their campaigns. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a minute ago that Democrats are just bad at politics and bad at negotiating with their constituents. What do we learn about the parties historically over time? I know particularly the Republican Party is morphed quite a bit, but are there things to learn about what each party does well, and any stories from your past that would be relevant there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so this is something that Republicans have always done. So, I remember I did a speech on housing policy for George W. Bush in Des Moines, Iowa in 2002, right? And every bit of the Republican ecosystem, whether or not it was think tanks, Congress, the governor, whoever it was, right, said this was the greatest speech about housing policy that's ever been given, right? As if like Moses carried down the tablets of housing policy, right, and delivered them to us. And that's the Republicans have always been very good about being coordinated and staying in line. We're going to be on message ruthlessly and relentlessly. I don't think it was this 2024, I think it was maybe 2023, Joe Biden gave a State of the Union address. Typically, if it's a Democrat or Republican gives, a response to the State of the Union, which is all can, and it's usually a disaster. But in the case of Biden, not one, but two different Democrats gave their response to their own guy's State of the Union address. Like, that's all you need to know, right? Which is like, there's this sort of inbred elitism, right? I'm smarter than you. I have to take I have to make sure that you know how I feel about something too, as opposed to saying like, he's the guy at the top of the ticket. We're going to live or die with him. And ultimately, look, for Biden, they thought that after the debate of last summer, they thought they were going to die with Biden. They did everything they could to get rid of him, and it didn't work. Republicans, again, have historically been willing and able to get in line, to keep their people in line. Their voters are going to show up, right? Typically speaking, their voters are going to show up. Democrats, year in and year out, cycle in and cycle out, have to convince their voters again and again to participate. And I think that, and even if I think it's an ugly North Star, Republicans always are able to define what that North Star is. Democrats look at a constellation and say, that's where we should go. And another one says, no, that's where we should go. And that one, no. And they go in all sorts of different directions. And the people who should otherwise support them go, where the heck are we supposed to go now?
How do you negotiate people off the couch if that's really the issue in this campaign?
It's a great question. So there's a gentleman I'm friends with. He's an activist in Eastern North Carolina, and he runs an organization called the Black Men's Voter Project. And even before Biden got out, he was very pessimistic about the black male vote for Democrats. In his county, Stan, the unemployment rate for black men is 18%.
Wow.
18%. And he said, what would happen if the unemployment rate for white guys was 18%? I said, we'd call it the Great Depression. And I think, to me, why I tell that story a lot is because, to me, it was so indicative that after decades of being, a key and core constituency of the Democratic Party, that the African-American vote wasn't going to be there just because Democrats said they had to be, if that makes sense. That there were millions of black men who were otherwise, available, right? These voters, any Democratic voter who stayed home was available to Kamala Harris. They didn't make the case. And again, I think it's because what has happened is, let's take it back to negotiation. If it's a business negotiation, it's by definition a transaction. Now, there will be emotions involved because somebody will be like, we're getting a bad deal, or, elation, like they gave us everything we wanted. But, in this case, it can't simply be transactional, because if all the transaction is, if you vote for me again, right? Because this is the most important election that's ever existed. And if you don't, the world will catch on fire. And then the world doesn't catch on fire and you don't keep your promises. It's really easy for somebody to say, forget it. I don't want to hear it again. You come to me with promises, you never keep them. I know you're not going to keep them, but I typically am not going to go with the other guy. And I think what we saw was just a lot of otherwise, decent people who said, and this is one thing my friend said, like, don't come to me with your democracy because we haven't really seen it. And don't come to me with your boogeyman because it's all I've ever known, right? Like, how am I as a 48-year-old white guy supposed to compete with that, right? I'm not, but I wouldn't try, because I would be like, from his perspective, that's a legitimate outlook. That's how he and his constituency see the world, which is, you think this guy could be worse than what me and my people have already been through? Like, it's not enough to say he's bad. We know he's bad. What makes you good?
Yeah, and at the risk of focusing too much on the turnout, one final question there, and then I want to move on to internal Democratic politics. Was the turnout much worse than in previous presidential elections for Democrats? I would have assumed that with Trump being such a lightning rod, it would have been easy to get people off the couch. I mean, if you're not going to get off the couch against Trump and you're a Democrat, you're not getting off the couch. But was it that different than previous elections?
I think it was. Again, I think also we shouldn't, when we're talking about turnout, I don't think we should deny that whereas in 2022, in the midterms, where young people, in particular young women, turned out in droves to mitigate, what should have normally been a very big Republican year, to make it basically a wash, a lot of those kids tuned out. here's the thing is, even before Gaza, even before October 7th, a lot of those younger voters already saw Biden as too old. That was already disqualifying for them. They might have voted Democrat, but they weren't doing it because of Joe Biden, if that makes sense. It wasn't going to be because of the top of the ticket. And so I think that's one part of it. I think that there was an underlying dissatisfaction amongst many of those same, again, I'd say more progressive younger voters about Gaza that really was, we could do a whole another hour, Stan, on social media and everything else, but infected those people to say that the problem is, in their mind, if you're going to be Donald Trump or you're going to be Joe Biden, there's no difference. So what difference does it make anyway, if that makes sense?
Well, that really resonates. I asked my students at Stanford how many of them were involved in either of the campaigns towards the end of the campaign cycle, and virtually no one was interested in either campaign. And when I asked them why, the response, shocking to me, was, we just don't think it affects us very much. Mm-hmm. And so neither campaign could affect, the elite kids at Stanford and make them get excited about a campaign. If the 20-somethings aren't excited, which is kind of the traditional excitable group, it's not that surprising to me that people didn't get off the couch.
Right. No, look, I mean, just as an aside, I was at Duke, I think in October, talking to the Duke Democratic Club. And I would say this is they were good, but they weren't climbing the rafters for Kamala Harris. In fact, a couple of them said, well, where do you think I should get unbiased news? Right? If they're asking me, then they're looking for something they're not getting either. And so, yeah, I think that was a big problem all the way around.
Let's go back to the Democratic Party and their internal negotiations. You're saying that Democrats are less effective internally at coordinating, getting on the same page, getting on message. They had a choice when Biden stepped down, even though it was, unfortunately late in the cycle of, do we run a primary? What's your view of that? Should they have done a primary? Was there a different path there for them?
Let me just say this. Whatever they had done, Kamala Harris would have been the nominee. It's very hard for me to believe that this version of the Democratic Party was not going to nominate the first woman of color to hold national office. And I think that probably would have been true even if it was something that started in, let's say, March or April of 2023. I think there would have been enormous pressure on the donor class to get behind Harris. I think there would have been enormous pressure by the activist class for others to get behind Harris. So to me, it was a foregone conclusion. It was really
didn't matter.
It was a process. I mean, let me say this. Just because I think the outcome would have been the same doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't have had a process, right? But again, I think that everything was so topsy-turvy, I'm not sure that it would have made sense. And you could see too that a lot of those governors, right, who seem to be, primed for a run next time around, if that happens, all they were like, nope, because they didn't want to get crossways with Harris or the donor class. And they thought, okay, well, look, Trump's got at least a 50-50 chance of winning. Do I want to be the one with the L on my record? And so I would say that, the Biden family didn't really give many people much notice. Then when the Harris people got the notice, they did a very good job of whipping, support to make sure that she had cleared the field. And, by the time it was all said and done, I'm not sure anybody, running a 100-day campaign was going to be able to overcome the hurdles. Look, I think Harris as a candidate did pretty well, considering that she's a B- candidate, right? She's not a natural. And that's not a knock on her. Most candidates aren't naturals. But she also didn't have, what a primary would have given her, which was the rough and tumble, the toughening up, right? The tanning of, the primary season that allows someone to really exercise those muscles. When you're vice president, as you know, Stan, you only really have two jobs: break ties and wait for somebody to die. It's not a great place to start from, but it's all they had, unfortunately.
Yeah, I heard so many people on both sides, Republican and Democrat, that were unhappy with their candidate. Is there a different way to select candidates? If you were kind of the candidate selection czar in either party, would you suggest a different process so we end up with better candidates in our country?
It's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer. I would say this is, if you wanted better candidates, rank and file Republicans and Democrats, not the people who are activists, would show up for primaries. They don't typically show up for primaries on either side. And so what you get typically is a more activist or extreme version of what the party, what rank and file members of the party see themselves as. And so if only the most dedicated and motivated 10 or 15% of people are going to show up to a primary election, well, then, the people who are most in tune with the most activist wing are likely to be successful. I do think that, ultimately the presidential primary process is as tough a gauntlet as human politics has ever presented. And if you can clear it, then you have probably done well because there are so many different states. Do I think that Iowa and New Hampshire should be the places these things start? I don't know. Do I think these things should take a year or two? I don't think they should. I think that's, a lot of this stuff is overdone. I think is someone who doesn't really consider themselves a consultant anymore, but spent most of my career in the consultant class, look, the whole thing is driven by you have to get in early, you have to raise money, you have to get these endorsements, you have to raise enough in the way of resources to hire staff in these different places. And some of that matters, but most of the time it doesn't, because you could win Iowa closely and get crushed in New Hampshire, and then you go to South Carolina, which is a totally different beast. And at that point, do things matter? They do. But again, I think that we're, come 2028, theoretically, Donald Trump is done. If I don't know if a J.D. Vance clears the field, but there'll be an open Democratic field. It's going to be the most different kind of primary that we've ever seen because it's going to be now nearly 30 years into the 21st century. And so many of the people who remembered traditional politics just won't be around anymore.
One more question about the campaign, then I want to turn to President Trump. Mm-hmm. The statistic that surprised me the most, you mentioned Latino men, you mentioned black men coming out stronger for Trump than was expected. I was even more surprised by white women. I think a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump. What's your diagnosis there? What happened? It was surprising to me. Did that surprise you?
It really did. What it said to me was that, frankly, the abortion issue was baked in, that people had already decided one way or the other. And in a lot of these places, right, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, abortion rights are secured in those places, right? Nevada. And so that wasn't an issue. And not that it wasn't an issue, it wasn't a motivating issue, I should say. But I do think it begs the question, there's a lot of folks on the left say, oh, there's racism and misogyny in America. Well, that's not new. We've had that for a long time. But again, I think it comes down to a cultural thing, which is maybe I don't like Donald Trump, right? But the Democrats aren't giving me anything that I can hold on to. They don't, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a conservative, but what I'm hearing about them, not even what they're saying, but what I'm hearing about them makes me not want to go there. And I would say this is to any of my Democratic friends listening, Stan, that's the one question I keep asking is you guys are talking about, okay, Latinos, you're talking about African Americans, but you lost white women. 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. Guys, you can't figure that out, right? There's no coming back. And I just remember even pre-debate, Stan, there was a survey out when Biden was still, it was down, but it was close, where the gender gap was only +4 for Biden. And even then, I was like, something's not right here. I couldn't diagnose it, unfortunately. Even if I could, I'm not sure I could have made a difference about it. But even then, I was like, wait a second, something's not right here because Trump should be losing women of all demographics by 40, and he's not.
Yeah, that one's still, I'm quizzical about it. I still don't, the culture argument isn't persuasive to me that there's sort of some overarching cultural issue that women have. Totally agree with you on abortion. I think it was just a non-issue. I do think the states are really deciding abortion these days. But I think around dignity, self-respect, men, in my view, should have had the same problems with Trump as women around misogyny, et cetera. But the fact that didn't motivate women really surprised me, and I still don't understand why.
Yeah, well, and it's probably as two guys, we're probably the last two in the world to really understand.
That's why we don't understand.
Right, exactly.
Well, let's turn to now President Trump. from my perspective, doesn't even believe in negotiation. He's got one approach. It's kind of a hardball approach. He draws lines in the sand. If people don't fall in line, he threatens them. I think that's what's happening currently. What's your perspective on, is Trump willing to negotiate? Is his style effective? I'm teaching a class that essentially saying you should think about relationships, you should think about the long term, and Trump is the kind of opposite of that, and it seems to be working. What's your perspective?
So his niece, Mary Trump, wrote a book about him back in 2020. And there's something that stuck with me from that book to this moment, which was that Trump realized, going back even to like kindergarten, Stan, that he could go do the most wild and outrageous and incredible things. And far more often than not, people didn't say no, didn't say stop, Donald. They stood and they stared. And I think that has been his motivating thing for the last nearly 80 years. If I do the most outrageous thing, most people don't know what to do. And they just get out of the way because a lot of times it's easier. And, you go back to Roy Cohn, right? You never surrender, you never apologize, you do this stuff and it's worked. And it tends to work because most people are not confrontational. Most people don't want the fight. Most people just want it's too much trouble. It's too much trouble. But he's done this his entire life, his entire career. It's like, he's threatened everybody. If somebody comes after him, he threatens them with a lawsuit. Well, if you're a guy pouring concrete at some building in New Jersey, you don't have the money for that, right? You're going to back off and you hope to God you get paid, but you don't. And how many times does the guy go bankrupt, right? People keep giving him money. And, he is and was a marketing machine, right? The Trump organization was never a construction company. It's a licensing machine, right? And so it's worked for him and it works for him now. And I think we shouldn't underestimate. There's a guy, Stephen Fish, is a professor of political science at Berkeley, wrote that we shouldn't underestimate the politics of dominance. He shows dominance 24/7. He goes into any room, right? And he believes, with the exception of maybe when he's with Vladimir Putin, that he is the biggest, strongest, smartest guy in the world. And of course, he surrounds himself with people that reinforce that. Now you take it to Washington, D.C., right? Which is, there's legislative stuff and everything else. With these cabinet picks, some of whom will fall by the wayside, but they'll get most of them. Why? Because they're going to lean on every member of the Republican Senate conference to say, you're going to do this. And I got Elon here, who's got $400 billion, and he's going to primary every single one of you if you don't get in line. And even if you're not up in 2026, right, we're going to dump millions of dollars into your state talking about what a terrible human being you are, right? Politicians are not brave for the most part, right? They're really not any more brave or upstanding than anybody else. They put their name on a line, they got elected, and what do they want to do now, Stan? They want to stay there, right? Self-preservation is their strongest instinct. And so for him, why would he change now? I first of all, I don't think he's capable of it anyway. And I think that there are people who, if Trump said, let's say they were negotiating something, whatever it is, and they needed to get it done because even Trump's people were like, Mr. President, you can't not do this. We can't go into a third week of having the government shut down. Even then he'll say, okay, fine. But we're going to say they did it because I said, okay. Right. So remember, he's not bound by norms. He's not bound by reality. He's not bound by the truth or anything else. It's all about him winning. And if the outcome is that things continue on, he has won. And so I think that we shouldn't expect that anything's going to change. And again, you have a Washington, D.C. I was back there in November for my dad's memorial service. And even then, right, which wasn't maybe 2-3 weeks after the election, Stan, the whole town had already capitulated, right? Everybody's like, okay, now how do we succeed in this new world? Or a world, frankly, we've seen before, but will probably be worse or different. It's a company town, right? It's the same as okay, JP Morgan went out of, Goldman Sachs went out of business. Who's the biggest now? JP Morgan. Okay, how do we work with them? Or a Hollywood, all right, that studio went out of business. Now this studio head's the grand poobah. How do we work with him? They get in line because there's too much money, there's too much influence, there's too much, possibility on the line. People are like, well, look, I've got a business to run. I have to be able to do work with these people. And Republicans and Democrats say that.
I'd hate to think that it's that simple. Let me push you on that a little bit.
Sure.
Mitt Romney famously said there are more important things than winning elections. Is it really as simple as, 54 Republicans don't want to give up their Senate seat, and there is no price they wouldn't pay to stay in office? I've been surprised, maybe naively so. The Republicans had multiple chances to cut Donald Trump loose. By many accounts, privately, they don't like him, members of the Republican Senate, but they go along. It's got to be more complex in my mind than they just want to keep their jobs. Or is there any morality as a criteria in the Republican Senate, or do you just feel like they've all sold out?
They've either sold out or they stood by. You spoke of Mitt Romney. McKay Coppins, writer for The Atlantic, wrote Romney's biography, which is an excellent book. And at one point, Romney says, that some of his colleagues couldn't believe that he was retiring. And he said, because these are people who, for the most part, they've succeeded in everything else in life. And now they're United States senators. And as my dad, God rest his soul, used to say, senators would still wear togas if they thought they could get away with it, right? He said that them leaving office would be akin to death. They couldn't imagine not being U.S. senators. They couldn't imagine not being feted and being, ferried around and being escorted and doing all these other things. There's only 100 of them on the whole planet, right? And they want to be one of them. And so I wish it was more complicated than that, but I really don't think it is.
Oh, that's too bad if it's true. So your diagnosis is, from a negotiation perspective, Trump's a bully. It's worked for him. He's not likely to change. So what do you do as a Democrat? How do you counter a bully in politics?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is you have to decide what line you're not going to cross, and you have to not cross that line. You have to stand your ground, even as, the political winds and everything else buffet you. And there will be threats and there will be ugliness, and you just have to stand your ground. I think the other part, too, that we shouldn't discount is that, yes, Trump is a bully, but remember that, like every good authoritarian movement, everyone underneath him probably hates one another, that they are all competing to climb that ladder. His organizations, whether or not it was the Trump organization or his first White House or his campaigns, have consistently and historically been nests of vipers. That, I have this expression: the only people MAGA hate more than you and me, Stan, are each other. And so, there will be people who, like Elon Musk is sitting there, right? Somebody's like, I can't believe we have to deal with this guy. How do we get rid of this guy? So there will be knives out for him. There will be, that guy's causing us trouble. We don't like him. How do we spend our time, getting rid of that guy? And so we shouldn't underestimate the idea of their own interplay with one another, mucking up their own works. And remember that Trump encourages a lot of this too, because in his mind, if everybody's fighting with each other, they can't be targeting him, which is, again, a very historic norm for leaders like that, right? That, keep your subordinates unsure of where they live in the world, and you maintain some semblance or vision of control. And then back to the Democrats for just a moment. I think that, again, they have to call things out. I think that if, let's take Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which I can't believe we're saying his name. If he's really against, dyes in, potentially toxic or carcinogenic dyes in food, we should hold them to that. All right, Bobby, you're right. Tell us, how are we going to get these dyes out of the food, right? Tell us how we're going to do that. And then make him take on, the cereal companies, which is something that the donor class doesn't want to do. The ideologues in Trump's White House don't want to do. So use the things that they've claimed to be for as wedges against them. Because if he says, yeah, I'm going to go after not Frosted Flakes, let's say Fruit Loops, right? God knows how many dyes those things have.
Not Fruit Loops.
Not Fruit Loops, right? But, whoever makes Fruit Loops, right? Well, that's a massive, agricultural conglomerate, or maybe it's a bigger food concern, right? They don't want to figure that out. That's going to cost them money. That's going to cost them market share. They don't want the director of Health and Human Services saying you shouldn't eat Fruit Loops. You're going to get cancer from the red ones. They don't want that. And so I think trying to figure out a little jujitsu is probably not a bad way for Democrats to be, especially, ironically enough, if they match the policy outlook that you share and you think would be good for the country.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the turnover at the senior level of the Trump administration, at the cabinet, is going to be as great as it was in his first term, both for the reason that you mentioned, which is they're going to have knives out for each other and just general level of competence. They're going to fail in a lot of those roles. And so I do think that the Democrats, jiu-jitsu is great, use the Trump tactics back on themselves, but they've got to put up some numbers. They've got to put up some policies. They've got to give constituents something to believe in. And I just don't think that they have done that in the past. I think it will take a lot for them to get the airtime to do it in the future. So I'm worried that waiting for the Trump administration to implode on itself isn't enough of a strategy. They've got to be a lot more proactive, and they've got to find some leadership. I mean, we don't have on the Democratic side that I know of, a Bill Clinton, a Barack Obama. The Democrats seem to need that kind of a figure, sort of a father or maybe mother figure.
Right.
I don't think Hillary Clinton was that person. I don't think Kamala Harris was that person. And so would you agree that the Democrats are kind of in need of a charismatic leader, or can they do it through their usual cerebral, consensual process?
I think that, well, let me go back. I think you're right. I mean, I wrote a piece on my Substack back in early November after I spoke to the, out in California, the South Orange County Democratic women, 300 fired up women who did everything they could this cycle. And I actually wrote a speech for the event, Stan, because I thought I owed it to them and I needed to work out my thoughts. And the name of the speech was The End of Anti. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. I spent the last 9 years being anti-Trump. I'm sick of talking about the guy. I'm sick of fighting the guy. But I'll do what I can. But at the same time, that's also what he wants. If it's an attention economy and all you do is spend all your time talking about him, right? Then he's winning, because there's nothing he won't say. There's nothing he won't do. And so I think you're right. I think there has to be some proactive messaging from the Democratic Party that speaks not to somebody at a salon on the Upper West Side, but speaks to somebody in Viroqua, Wisconsin, right? And I've been to these small towns and medium-sized towns all over the country. They are filled with decent people. They are filled with people who care desperately for their communities and are dealing with stuff that you and I, frankly, don't have to deal with on a daily basis. In Wisconsin Rapids, right, we drove by this gigantic building. And I'm like, what is that? And they're like, that's the paper mill. I mean, Stan, the thing must have been a mile long and 400 feet tall. Went out of business, took 900 jobs with it, right? In a town of 20,000. That's backbreaking, right? Is anybody worried about them? Probably not. Is anybody talking to them in a way that they need to hear things? Probably not. What are those 900 guys doing? What are their families doing? How many other jobs in town were connected to those 900 on the floor, right? And so, that company picked up and left. Okay, right? But now, what do they do? And no one's talking to them. Frankly, the Trump people aren't talking to them either. They're just keeping them angry. So I think there's a real opportunity to get out there. And that's what I'm going to spend my 25 and 26 doing is, you got to listen. People want to be heard, but then they want to be told, okay, now you've listened to me. Now what? What are you going to do? It's not even what are you going to do? What do you believe? And so I think that's right. And then it'll be interesting to see what happens, because the gerontocracy of the Democratic Party does not want to let go. And it's just this, it's amazing, Stan, that we've been, a coherent species for I don't know how many thousands of years, but still people get into their 80s. They've had positions of authority for decades, and they still don't think that they're going to die someday, right? That somehow the world isn't going to keep spinning after we go to heaven. And, they have to make a concerted effort. I think the younger members of the Democratic leadership and the middle-aged members of the Democratic leadership have to look at their elders and say, thank you for all you've done. I need you to move on. Thank you for what you've done for us. Thank you for your work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's time to go. We don't need another book by Bill Clinton telling us about what he did after his presidency. We don't need another book by Hillary Clinton telling us about her vision of the world, right? We don't need that anymore. And you could make an argument that the 90s were, Pax Americana, low unemployment, we had budget surpluses and everything else. But a lot of what happened in that decade is we're dealing with now, right? And so I think that, and that's the thing too, is so many voters who are now participating don't remember the Clinton years. A lot of them probably don't even remember the Obama years. I mean, think about this. A friend of mine who still works in Republican politics, they consider Barack Obama a moderate Democrat. Think about that, right? Wow. That's how Republicans see Obama now. So I would say that it's going to take a mixture of leadership, philosophy, and you know what? Here's the word I'm using a lot, Stan, work. A lot of this is going to take work. Republicans are relentless. They're well-resourced, and they're willing to do the work all day, every day. Democrats don't have to do it like Republicans do. Remember, all things considered, again, these voters stayed home. It's not like they crossed the line for Trump en masse. They stayed home. Democrats don't have to, move 25 million people. They have to move about 5 million people in the right places. The question is whether or not they can get out of their own way long enough to make that happen.
I don't think Trump is going to offer much to the middle class. I don't think he's going to offer them much economically or culturally. If you look at the values of this country, I don't think they're the ones that Trump is pushing. And so I think you point out that the Democrats have missed a cultural moment, and I agree with that, but I also think the Republicans have. And I think that his cultural bluster is just that. I don't think any of what he advertises is consistent with the values of the country.
Right.
And I think there's a good chance he's going to hurt us economically. The thing that people point to is the tariffs, but there are other things that it's just unlikely that he's going to offer the middle class an economic way out or a cultural way out. And I think the Democrats have to seize on that.
100%. And I think that's where, again, what I've always said to my Democratic friends are like, oh, you guys fight so dirty, blah, blah, blah. And Trump says everything you need to take him on, right? He said tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. If he imposes tariffs and prices go up, you don't have to be hyperbolic about it, right? You don't have to light your hair on fire and go, see. You just have to go, Donald Trump said he was going to impose 10% tariffs on X. He did. Here's what happened. He told you he was going to do it. He did it. Here's what happened. Your prices went up. Your prices went up. And you have to say it over and over and over and over again, right? Because, you have to bring it to a place where people can live, where they live. They don't live on MSNBC. They don't live on CNN. They live on their phones. They live between shifts at work. They live between, pickups and drop-offs for their kids. Like, that's where they're living. They're in the car. And so you have to have a consistent message of, he told you he was going to do these things. He kept his promise. And now look what that promise is doing, right? And, it's like, and I would say this too, and I say this to my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle who are so upset and so frustrated. If you keep saying to the people who either stayed home or voted for this guy, who are not MAGA diehards, that they are stupid and they did this because of the price of eggs and you're going to get what's coming to you and everything else, like, that's not an inviting message. It's as frustrating to me as it is to you. But like, we got to go get white women back. We got to get young white guys back. We got to get Latinos back. Like, the idea that, like, because you happen to be, of Mexican descent or Guatemalan descent or Costa Rican descent, somehow that you're now like an open borders advocate, like, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, Trump on the Texas border won a county this year, or in 2024, that Biden had won with like 83% of the vote 4 years ago, right? Like, that's crazy. That's like unbelievable, Stan, in politics, that kind of shift. But again, it's one of those things where, Trump spiked a border bill. Democrats Democrats gave Republicans everything they wanted on that. And you know what? When push came to shove, they weren't willing to back it up. Biden would, because he's like, I'm bleeding out here. I've got to solve this problem. He was willing to solve it. The problem was everybody else wasn't willing to go along with him. Biden was always realpolitik, right? For all of his other faults, he always very well understood the nature of the electorate. He's not a progressive, right? He never was. And he understood, like, to your point about like winning, it's Mitch McConnell of all people who said, winners make policy and losers go home. That's what I tell my friends. You have to win elections. We have to get rid of the electoral college. It's not fair that Idaho has 2 senators and California has 2 senators. Like, okay, maybe not, but that is the system in which we're playing. So you can decide that you're never going to go back to Idaho or North Dakota or South Dakota, but like, that's where we are.
Yeah, so people are frustrated, I think, on both sides. I think there's a plurality of the country that doesn't appreciate the divide that exists, and most people aren't very political. So what would your advice be if people are saying, I want to negotiate that divide, I want to decrease the tensions with the other side?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, it sounds trite, and maybe it is, but, we can't be a country where people are afraid to go to their relatives' homes for holidays because of politics. Now, look, every family has family tensions going back decades from God knows, what your sister or your aunt did to you or said to you 20 years ago. Okay, that's normal. That's normal humanity. But we can't and shouldn't be a country where people are afraid to go to the holidays with the people that are supposed to be closest to them because of a guy named Donald Trump or whatever. I do think, based on, and this is more anecdotal than anything, but I'll just tell you, based on a lot of the places I went in the fall of 2024, these people act disconnected, Stan, and they feel disconnected because they are. My guess is that they're not uninformed, right? Disconnected and uninformed are two different things. I think that a lot of these voters who either pulled the lever for Trump or stayed home are perfectly well informed. They just don't like what they're hearing, and they don't hear it from people that they trust. And they're not talking, and the people that are talking to them aren't talking about things that, again, are germane to their lives or frankly, the things they want to talk about. If I'm in Michigan, right, does somebody want to talk about the politics of Michigan, or they want to talk about the Detroit Lions? Like, if they want to talk about the Detroit Lions, fine, right? Anything to get people talking, anything to build, to your point, some level of camaraderie, which is going to have to start small, and it's a lot of times going to be unsatisfying. I get that. But that's where, because the ties that bind are not, based on what a bunch of morons in Washington, D.C. and New York say, right? Because their data told them that. It's going to be people who live on the same street who haven't talked in years, not because they're politically unaligned, but because they haven't had any reason to, right? I mean, if you think about it, community is the biggest thing that we're missing. And I think that, it could be, I'm going to go out and do some of these things. I told the friend I mentioned in Eastern North Carolina, I said, rent a hall, order some food, invite as many people as you can. I'm going to come have dinner. I want to talk to everybody. There's not going to be, Stan, there's not going to be cameras there. I'm not going to record it, right? I might write about it, but it's not about that. It's not performative, if that makes sense. And people know when it's performative. If you're going to go talk to people, right, or if you're going to let people talk to you, I think is a better way to put it, you actually have to listen to them, if that makes sense. And I have been lucky enough to be invited into people's homes to speak from the pulpit in a couple of African-American churches, to meet people all over this great country. And as I said, I think there are more people who care about the country, who believe that the United States is a great place. That's the other thing too, is it's very hard just from a negotiating tactic. If one of the things that the vast majority of the electorate believes is that you don't like the country you're asking to run, it's very hard to convince people to give you the job, if that makes sense. Are we perfect? We're not. But no one's expecting perfection. But if you're like, America is terrible, here's why I should lead it, right? Hard to make that case.
Yet it was made, and Trump won. I guess I'm trying to decide whether to bring this up, but it's my experience that people do like each other if they actually spend time together. Mm-hmm. And there are very few exceptions. I've, negotiated deals in 75 different countries. We did some work in Israel, and on the Palestinian situation, I was involved in mediating the dispute between water rights to the Jordan River between Israel and Jordan. And what we found is when you got the young kids together and we formed some soccer teams and soccer leagues and mixed them up, they liked each other. And so I think that's true for Trump and Harris voters. We've got to get people talking to each other. You brought up before, and we should do a separate podcast on this, but I'm going to get 5 minutes of your thinking, then we're going to close it out.
Sure.
Just on why social media has made that hard. Is there an antidote there? X has been taken over by Musk. That's a hard venue these days.
Yeah.
Give us kind of your best thinking on antidote there. You and I are going to agree with the problem all day long, but is there something that can be done to get us away from screens and social media, and how could that help?
I would say let me just say this, and I'll speak for myself. I think there might be a little bit of that naturally, because I think that Twitter is unusable at this point. But I'll tell you this, I've joined Blue Sky. I don't find Blue Sky to be that much more useful. if that makes
No,
sense.
I don't think so.
It's just the same people who used to be on Twitter now talking to each other without trolls.
Yeah.
And so I would say that I think there's going to be some natural withdrawal from those kinds of forums, just because Twitter used to be a place where you could talk about anything, and it could be politics, it could be basketball, it could be crocheting, whatever it was. You can't really do that now. I think that, if TikTok gets banned, that'll go. I think there's a lot of people using Instagram now. I think you're probably going to see a rise in the video stuff. But, I think that you could very well see that there will be a whole bunch of different sort of micro places that people go. Maybe it's based on geography, maybe it's based on interest, and it's not, a broad-based thing like X or Blue Sky. It's just going to be places where people talk about this. I mean, look, think about this. The video game industry is massive, many times larger, I think, than like the movie industry, right? They've got all sorts of their own outlets where they talk to each other all day. I couldn't tell you how any of them work. I couldn't tell you that I've ever been there. If I went there, I wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it. But I would say that there are a lot of places that already exist that are worthy of understanding, at least, and then, seeing if there's a way to communicate to those people. But, social media, look, I mean, we've been through this a million times, right? The algorithms encourage bad behavior and they double down on it. You could go to Section 230 reform. Do I think that's going to happen under a Trump administration? I don't, because Elon is sitting there. Zuckerberg will pay Trump whatever he thinks he needs to avoid it. And so I don't think we're going to see any change there. Again, I think a lot of this is going to start small. It's going to have to be independent. Look, the media landscape is shattered. I must know hundreds of otherwise very talented reporters and journalists who are out of work. Some of them who are, really true believers in their craft are starting their own things, and they're starting to see some early success. I think that's great. From my perspective, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But I think that we're going to be in this not disconnected, that's not the right word, but this, there's disassociation going on in the media landscape. And I think that's going to exist for a while. Now, will gravity start to pull some of them together? Maybe. But I think that, from my perspective, I hope the investment is there. Not from a political perspective. If those investors are, let's say left-leaning or independent or soft conservative donors, right, who are willing to make those investments, I hope they are, and understand that, media outlets, don't really turn a profit quickly, if ever, right? It's basically a public good more than it is a profit vehicle. And so I'm interested to see what happens. Again, I think that you'll see people fleeing X, not because it's Elon's, but because it's just not fun anymore. It's not useful anymore. And I don't know that there's enough people who are like, oh, well, Blue Sky's got 25 million people. Okay, great. There's 330 million people in the country, right? That means 90% of them are doing something else at any given moment.
Well, you and I both come from the Republican Party. I've spent the majority of my life, grew up Republican.
Yeah.
We both think of ourselves as moderate in terms of politics and values. There isn't much of a place, but I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, trying to revive the moderate wing of the Republican Party and fight against, the anti-democratic inclinations, I think, of the Trump administration. Both your work at the Homefront, your podcast, your work as a co-founder of the Lincoln Project have just been so persuasive. Tell us about where we can hear more from you. Tell us about, a little more than I have about your podcast, your Substack. How do we get on board with helping your cause?
No, and Stan, thanks again for having me. Yeah, so, look, I have both a Substack and a podcast called The Homefront, and it's really taking a look, most of those were really based on the election, right? Now I'm starting to look forward. I want to have those conversations with different people from all, not all walks of life necessarily. There's always going to be a political aspect to it, a cultural aspect to it. But what I like to do is find the people who are the best at whatever it is they're doing and introduce them to an audience that is very engaged, very active, and is looking for something to do, looking for work to participate in. And so I think that's one. And then second, on the Substack and the writing piece is really offering, from my perspective, where I think we've gone wrong and how we can fix it. but also, leaning back on it's hard to believe, nearly 30 years of experience I've had in this as, look, I grew up in the Republican Party, literally, right? My dad worked on Capitol Hill. I went there for summer camp instead of going to, hang out with other kids, which is probably why I turned out the way I did. But, and I've spent 5 years fighting alongside Democrats. So it's been a fascinating journey. I find myself to be an independent. I was never a conservative, if that makes sense. I was never a great Republican. I fell into it. But if Mark Twain said, the two most important days in a man's life are the day he's born and the day he knows why, like I've reached the second of those. And it is really going out and talking to people and listening to people. And to your point, most people are overwhelmingly decent. Right now, look, I did get chased around in Pennsylvania by a man who threatened to shoot us if we ever came back to his neighborhood. But he's 30 years downstream of Rush Limbaugh and Fox News and Donald Trump and everything else. I'm going to still call him the outlier, right? Yeah. I still think he's the outlier. I think that otherwise people are dedicated to their family and their friends and their communities, and they want to do the best, and they want to feel like people who are supposed to be doing their jobs are doing their jobs. And so to that end, so to take all of my writing and yakking and make that into some kind of tangible work, Stan, I run an organization called The Union, which is at jointheunion.us. It was a subsidiary of the Lincoln Project that we started back in March of 2022 to really serve as our grassroots wing. And over the course of almost 3 years now, we have more than 140 partner organizations in all 50 states. We will be doing a relaunch here in just a few days of, we have organizations in 16 states. We're going to expand that to all 50. And really it's simple to describe, but the work will be hard, which is, build some infrastructure, build some community, and take some action. And, some of that, in fact, a lot of that will not be overtly political, right? It will really just be about building organizations in communities that feel like they've been left behind, because in many cases they have been. And then hopefully helping recruit candidates. There are good representatives of the voters that they're asking, to elect them. And so, that's how we're going to spend our time in the next couple of years. We're going to throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. I don't think anybody should believe that if somebody tells you, Stan, right now that they know how to do this 100% and that they know if I do X in place one, that it will absolutely work, they are lying to you. I think that there are going to be things that work in some places that don't work in others. There are going to be some things that are interesting but don't scale. There are going to be some things that are boring that scale well. And I think we should be completely open-minded, both, strategically and tactically on that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your work, and thanks for taking the time to come on the podcast. It's been a great discussion.
No, thanks, Stan, for having me.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.